no power greater than X.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to The Extra Mile. This is the tag-along podcast for the Xbox Drive and the PlayStation Drive, where we talk about the games and services that you, yes you, care about most. As always, I'm one of your hosts this time around, Ryan Turford, the man on the moose, and we had a pretty sweet opportunity handed to us by our friends over at Xbox Canada and Double Fine to preview Psychonauts 2 a little bit early. So we got a chance to actually play the game. Basically, I played the first 5 hours or so of the game, as well as some other stuff. So I'm going to talk about that here. Of course, this is a preview. It's not meant to be a review or anything like that. This is not meant to be my final thoughts on the game either. It's very much meant to basically be a situation where I talk about my thoughts on the game before it comes out and kind of my initial playtime with Psychonauts 2. So I want to say, first off, huge thank you, of course, and shout out to our friends at Xbox Canada and Double Fine for making this opportunity happen. Again, this is not something that happens very often, again, the last time we actually did a preview was the time that Sean actually went to the Coalition in 2019, and we did a preview for Gears 5 there, and that was actually the very first episode of The Extra Mile was actually Sean doing kind of his preview for Gears of War 5. So this time around, we're doing Psychonauts 2. Of course, a little bit of background from me personally with the Psychonauts series, now that it is a series because we have multiple games now. I was a huge fan of the first game. I actually did an entire episode of it on the Crossroads, dedicated to Psychonauts 1. You can actually go listen to it on the Xbox Drive feed. Just look for the Psychonauts episode as part of the Crossroads. I did a whole episode. I went in depth with Psychonauts there. So if you want to know my full thoughts on the first game, as well as if you maybe missed the first game and want to know more about it, that's definitely the place to go learn more information about that. So I really love the first game, even though I think if you play it now today, like some of the platforming doesn't hold up as well, just because, again, it's like in the earlier days of 3D platforming, and the controls aren't as refined as, modern 3D platformers. Like it doesn't feel as good, for example, to play as like something like Mario Odyssey or something like that. And I mean, I was never expecting it to, but obviously it's a little bit tougher to go back to games of that era, not just Psychonauts, but the games of that era that are platformers in 3D, because I think everyone was just trying to learn how that space worked. So it's not perfect, but at the same time, Psychonauts, the original, was like one of my favorite games in the year came out in. So it was actually a Game of the Year contender at a lot of different outlets as well. It wasn't just me who really liked that game. So with Psychonauts 2, I know there's a lot of hype going into it, especially because I remember when the Kickstarter first got announced, people were super excited that Psychonauts was actually coming back. We also had Psychonauts in the Rhombus of Ruin, which is a PlayStation VR game, which actually ties a little bit into the story of this game as well. So if you've actually played Rhombus of Ruin, you'll actually notice some cool Easter eggs and stuff in Psychonauts 2, which I thought was really, really, really cool. So at the same time, if you haven't played it, I don't think you need to in order to kind of grasp the story. Again, it does enough kind of retelling to kind of give you all the information you kind of need to get through the story in this game. So let's talk about Psychonauts 2. So as I stated earlier, I played about 5 hours of the game. Basically, I played through 4 different brain puzzles, which are essentially like the main kind of levels in Psychonauts. Again, this goes back to the original Psychonauts, where you're essentially going into people's brains and exploring them, and obviously depending on the person, the brain will change accordingly, and likewise according to their cognition. So for example, if they're feeling like anxiety or something like that, like some things will happen to the brain. It's actually like a really creative game. The original Psychonauts and Psychonauts 2, I would have to say, is probably in the same boat. So, of course, obviously, if you're watching the video version of this preview, you're noticing I'm not actually showing the gameplay. That's because actually Psychonauts 2, very story heavy. In fact, a little more story heavy than I was expecting, even though, again, the first game was actually really story heavy, but I feel like this one actually is even more story heavy, and I don't want to spoil anything about the story besides what's been seen in the trailers or what has already been previously talked about from Double Fine. So that's the main reason why you're not seeing any gameplay, because I don't want to show off some of the really inventive and cool areas that are actually in Psychonauts 2. But we'll talk about them a little bit. So obviously, quick story setup to get yourself caught up in case you haven't been paying attention at all to this game. So number one, if you haven't played the first game, either A, you can go listen to my Crossroads episode, but B, there's actually a cinematic at the very beginning of the game that basically, like when you start a new game, it'll actually show you, and it's as soon as you start the game, that basically does a full recap of Psychonauts 1. So if you haven't played the first game, it catches you up with the story really quick and in a really like fun and inventive way. Again, I like this cinematic and kind of the humorous tone it's going for. So I did really appreciate that. So again, anyone who hasn't played the first game, you're not going to be lost or anything like that. It gives you kind of all the story beats that you kind of need to get into Psychonauts 2 with no problem. Now, in Psychonauts 2, of course, you play as Raz once again, aka Rasputin, that's his full name, as he has completed his training and is ready to become a full-fledged member of the Psychonauts agency. And they're basically like almost like the FBI or something like that, but for brains. So they go into people's brains to, again, try and help them out with any issues they're having, or to maybe stop like criminal organizations or whatnot from doing bad things. Only to find out, however, that he is not able to join the Psychonauts. So he was actually promised at the end of the first game, oh yeah, with this badge, you'll be able to become a full-fledged Psychonaut. But you find very quickly that that is not actually going to be the case. However, he is allowed to join the Internship program of the Psychonauts, putting him together with another class of hopeful Psychonauts. Together they learn the ropes of what it means to be a Psychonaut, as well as solving a mystery at the Psychonauts agent. So again, there's a lot of mysterious stuff going on at the Psychonauts agency. It's cool actually because we had heard kind of so much about the Psychonauts agency from the first game that I was like really wondering what it would be like to kind of explore this environment. And that's actually kind of the main kind of hub location in this game. Mind you, it's not a hub location in the traditional sense like an open world game or anything like that. It is pretty open. You can kind of go explore it, and more areas will be unlocked to you as you kind of complete the story. But it's not like, I wouldn't consider it a hub city like in a Rise of the Tomb Raider or a Destiny 2 or something like that. Like I think it's very different from that because again, this game is fairly linear. I mean, you're pretty much going from point A to point B with a little bit of exploration along the way. So the story itself, I thought was actually really charming, really humorous. Again, I like kind of the direction that they're going in with the story, at least in the first playthrough segments that I kind of went through. And all in all, I think they did a really good job of kind of continuing some really impressive writing from the first game. Because of course, the first game, one of the things I loved about the first game was the writing. I think that, and this goes along with almost every Double Fine game as well, because Double Fine has always really done excellent writing in their games. They're always like really quirky and humorous, and that's just how I feel about this game too. You can definitely tell it's a Tim Schafer game, that's for sure. But also it just has that Double Fine flavor that I just really, really, really like. So if you like humor in some of the other Double Fine games like Brutal Legend or Costume Quest, or if you like older Tim Schafer games like Grim Fandango or Full Throttle, then I think you're definitely going to like the humor in Psychonauts 2. It's definitely there. And again, you've got some fairly long cutscenes in this game. I mean, you had longer cutscenes in the first game, but I think like they've stepped up the storytelling to a degree in this one, and they definitely like to be a little more wordy with the story, which I actually really liked because again, the story I thought was really interesting, at least again within the first couple hours that I played, as well as I thought it was funny. So there are some really good laugh out loud moments. Of course, not every joke totally landed with me personally, but I honestly really liked the humor or some of the references to the last game as well. So if you've definitely played the last game or even Rhombus of Ruin, like I mentioned earlier, you will get a little more out of the humor because there are definitely callbacks to previous games. So let's talk about the visuals, because one of the things that I noticed right away with this game is, now mind you, I should preface this, I was playing this on Xbox Series X. That was the only console I had a chance to check this out on. But this game looked gorgeous. Like it looked really, really, really pretty. Like it almost reminded me of something like a Tim Burton movie, like Nightmare Before Christmas or Corpse Bride or something like that, where it looked like almost like the characters are kind of almost like puppets, but they've got these like weird kind of look to them. Again, they're not, most of them are just not normal humans or anything like that. And each of the characters has like a really distinct look to them, which I really appreciated. Again, the first game also had a very similar look to this one, but I feel like this time around with Psychonauts 2, the visuals were just you can definitely tell the budget is really increased this time around. Like the visuals were just through the roof with this game. It actually looks really impressive. I wouldn't say it's like one of the most impressive games I've seen today, but it's definitely one of the most visually impressive games I've played on Series X so far at the time of this recording, of course, because obviously I haven't played Flight Simulator or some of the other games that are coming out soon. But at the same time, I think this game visually looks great. Like, I really like the visual look for this game. Not only that, but what I liked about exploring some of the brain puzzles is just how they play with the visuals in some of the brain puzzles. For example, one of the examples I remember really distinctly in the very first intro section of the game is you're going down a hallway, but then like the character that you're trying, the person that you're in their brain realizes that you're actually like in their brain, kind of trying to tail them. So like they start running away from you, but like the hallways, for example, like start expanding, and as you're kind of running down them, it's like a great effect that you usually only see in movies and in games every once in a while. But like they did this in like a really cool visual style that I really, really, really liked. So not only that, but creatively, there's nothing like this out there at all as far as the visuals. Again, when you're exploring some of the brain puzzles, again, they're meant to kind of reflect the thoughts and feelings of the person whose brain you're in, essentially. And I really liked just how different all the locations that you went to were. Like, no two brain puzzles felt the same at all. Like, they felt both visually and thematically very, very different from each other. Not only that, but they were also very different from, what we had in the very first Psychonauts, which was really interesting. Not only that, but as you kind of learn more and more about the backstory of the person whose brain you're in, like, it just, the way the brain kind of shapes around that idea, combined with the fact that you're kind of learning more about why the brain is like this scattered mess that it is. I just thought it was so interesting and cool. So yeah, I really loved the visual style of this game. I like kind of the look of all the brain puzzles that I played. And yeah, there's definitely no other game that looks and plays like Psychonauts does. We'll get into the gameplay in a little bit, but visually, I really enjoyed playing through this game. Now, I've got some visual stats, of course, that were supplied to us by Double Fine, kind of going over what resolution and frame rate it runs at, because obviously this is appearing on multiple platforms. So we wanted to kind of indicate that here. So first off, on Series X, and I can basically confirm this is the case, it runs at 4K 60. It was buttery smooth throughout my entire experience. I didn't actually run into any frame drops or anything like that, regardless of what I did to try and break the game. So there wasn't any type of frame rate drops or anything like that. Again, you don't have a lot of stuff on screen all the time anyways, besides a bunch of visually large areas, but you don't really have like a number of different objects on screen anyways. You're not really dealing with like hundreds of enemies at a time or anything like that. So it kind of makes sense that it would run like pretty much at a buttery smooth, rock solid 60 frames per second. However, if you have one of those fancy HDMI 2.1 TVs, you actually can play the game at 120 frames per second. However, you do lose a little bit of resolution because it goes down to 1440p. So keep that in mind. If you have a Series S, however, the game itself runs at 2880 by 1620. So it's a little bit above 1440p at 60 frames per second. So it's not going at full 4K, but you're actually pretty close to 4K at 60 frames per second on Series S, which is actually really impressive. You can also play the game on Series S at 120 frames per second. However, you drop down to 1080p. So just keep that in mind. But you do have the option. It's nice to have that option available to you. As far as if you have an Xbox One X or base Xbox One, it is 4K 30 on One X, and then it is 1080p 30 frames per second on base Xbox One. So no 60 frames per second on One X or Xbox One or One S. But again, running in full 4K is going to look really pretty on Xbox One X. So I think the trade-off's probably okay. And plus, again, it's a 3D platformer that's all about puzzles, so I wouldn't worry too much about needing the 60 frames per second. It probably would run okay at 30, but man, it looks really good at 60 frames per second on Series X. As far as PlayStation goes, it's 1440p on PS4 Pro and PS5, so there's no differentiation between the resolution between those two. However, they have actually confirmed that it will run at 60 frames per second on PS5 in backwards compatibility mode. So I'm guessing there will be some kind of patch that kind of unlocks the frame rate or kind of boosts that up if you have a PlayStation 5. But that's what Double Fine told us. So I'm just reporting the facts here. I don't really know how that works. Last but not least, if you have a base PS4, it will run at 1080p at 30 frames per second. So there you go. Those are all the stats, all the things you kind of need to know about the visuals for Psychonauts 2. Now let's talk about the gameplay for Psychonauts 2. What exactly are you doing in this crazy game about investigating people's brains? Well, I'm glad you asked, because essentially what you're doing is it's a puzzle platform game. So there is some light combat in this game. First of all, I will say that there was some combat in the first game, but it is very much improved in this game. You've got a wide variety of enemies that, again, will pop up when you're investigating people's brain, such as sensors, which are basically like the kind of your subconscious trying to basically push out, elements that aren't supposed to be there. Those are some really interesting enemies, as well as just a whole bunch of other different enemy types. There's some flying enemies, a lot of ground enemies, and then you're kind of mix and match a lot of some of these enemies in different areas, and you kind of have to think about it like a combat puzzle to kind of take them down. Luckily, though, you have lots of powers at your disposal as Raz, because again, you're a psychic in this game. So you have telekinesis in this game, so you can pick up other objects and throw them at enemies. Very similar to something like Scarlet Nexus, where we saw there, where you actually can pick up other objects and throw them at enemies. You've got pyrokinesis, so you can actually light enemies on fire, as well as a bunch of different powers that, again, I don't want to spoil because I really liked learning about them as I played through it. And again, I don't want to, provide any spoilers before the game comes out. So those were the two that really came to mind, especially when we seen them at the trailer, but two, I know at least telekinesis was in the first game. I think pyrokinesis was too. I'm just might be remembering it incorrectly. But also, I really like too with the combat how these powers, you had to really think about which ones to use against specific enemies, because some enemies, for example, you can are weak to fire. You can essentially just light them on fire and they just run around screaming with their arms flailing and stuff like that, as their health ticks down, which I think was really, really cool. Or again, some enemies, again, will get stunned if you throw objects at them, but a lot of times they have a permanent block up if you don't, so you kind of have to use your telekinesis to do that. And essentially balancing all 9 powers in combat just felt really cool and interesting. And again, there wasn't too much combat in the levels that I played, and I imagine that in the full game, there's not going to be a ton of combat at all. But I did really like what was there. Again, it felt a little bit button mashy in the sense that you don't really have a bunch of different combos or anything like that, at least as far as I could tell throughout my playtime experience. But I did really like the combat that was there. It was actually pretty fun. Again, not crazy over the top, nothing like, Scarlet Nexus, Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden kind of level. But for what it was worth, it was actually really fun. Bosses are another matter, because for the most part, you're not really doing a lot of fighting against bosses in this game, because each kind of brain puzzle usually had its own boss at the end of it. And when you're fighting the boss, usually it's just one big puzzle that you're trying to solve, essentially, to try and take down the boss's health. Sometimes the puzzle will result in the boss getting stunned, and then you'll kind of whack the boss a little bit, kind of like, stunning the big spider in the very first dungeon in Ocarina of Time, for example, and then you just wailing at its eye. Very similar kind of situation with at least one of the bosses in this. But some of the other ones, you're mostly just trying to solve the puzzle to try and, harm them or take down their life bar, essentially. Which, again, I thought it was kind of cool and thematic for the game anyways. It definitely felt like, that was kind of the way it worked. And again, none of them are really too complex or anything like that. If anything, they kind of reminded me of some of the bosses you'd fight in some of the Mario games or some Nintendo franchises, where essentially you knock them down 3 times and then usually you win, kind of thing. So it was very much that type of formula this time around with the bosses. But I actually, again, felt like it was kind of true to Psychonauts, and it felt, thematically part of the gameplay. So it actually felt, really unique there. Again, as I mentioned, Psychonauts is more of a 3D puzzle platformer rather than a combat action game. So you're mostly, again, exploring these different brain puzzle environments and trying to basically solve puzzles to get to different areas of the brain essentially, and kind of get to the end of the brain to kind of solve the problem for the person. So sometimes that'll have you collecting different objects. Sometimes it'll have you do some really complex platforming, as well as doing other tasks along the way, like finding keys and switches and other things like that, or just trying to figure out where to go is a big part of it too. But again, I didn't really ever feel lost or anything like that. There wasn't really, out of the 4 brain puzzles that I played, I found all 4 to be actually easy and straightforward to kind of get through. I didn't really find like there was too many issues kind of getting through any of them or anything like that. I did play on normal difficulty without turning on any of the accessibility options, and there are lots of accessibility options on here. I know people have been talking about the invincible mode, where you actually don't take any damage. That is an option in here as well. If you just want to play the game and not worry about a lot of the combat, and just just want to have fun with the story, you can definitely do that. That is up to you. So yeah, there are all those options in there. We'll talk about those more probably when we do an in-depth discussion when the game fully comes out, though. I think that's kind of what we're going to kind of save that discussion. But the platforming itself, again, feels much improved from the first game. That was one of the things that I noticed right away as soon as I started playing it. It just felt like so much more fluid and natural, hopping around it as Raz. Of course, you've got a double jump. You can unlock a triple jump later, as well as a whole bunch of other movement skills a little bit later on in the experience. I will say, though, that there are some odd stumbles and frustrations I had with some of the platforming sections in one of the brain puzzles in particular of the 3, which again, I'm not going to spoil which one it is, but I will say that it had some rough sections to it where I had to think about it, like it had to do a lot of thinking as to how to really approach some of the platforming, and it just led to more deaths than I'm willing to admit here, because I wasn't expecting to die that much in that area, but I did really enjoy the platforming despite kind of the frustrations I kind of ran into. So yeah, I really liked the platforming in this game. It felt really tight. It felt I never felt like I was missing jumps or anything like that, because that's one of the things that 3D platformers, for example, can kind of miss. And I know, again, going back and playing the original Psychonauts, again, it kind of felt like sometimes I would miss my jump because I wouldn't be able to properly calculate in my head the distance between the platforms, because you didn't have enough visual cues to kind of determine the distance. Whereas I never felt like that was the case in this game. Like, I never felt like I was really going to miss a jump, and if I missed a jump, it was definitely my fault. Like that, which is where you kind of want the difficulty to be for a 3D platformer like this. So again, you're solving puzzles along the way, you're doing some platforming, and yeah, the platforming itself, really, really fun. Again, overall, the gameplay itself, hugely improved from the first game. I thought that this felt just so much more fun to play than the original Psychonauts, which says a lot, because actually, again, playing that game back in the day, I really loved playing it then. I know, again, the gameplay hasn't really aged as well as the story has, because the story from the first game is still fantastic with some excellent writing. So it is worth playing just for that alone. But the platforming in the second game and the combat, way better. Much, much, much better from the first game. So let's go to final thoughts, of course. So Psychonauts 2 was a game I was already pretty excited about. I was already on the fence about whether or not I should buy it right away or not. But then, of course, it's coming to Game Pass. So, I mean, for the most part, you can just play it there if you've got Xbox Game Pass, whether you're on PC or on Xbox. So I'm actually much more excited now for the full game than I was going into this preview. Because again, I was pretty excited about it already, because I did really like the first game. And again, revisiting it last year for the Crossroads and then doing like a full episode on it got me even more excited for Psychonauts 2. And then after playing it, I'm just like, man, I'm really excited for this game. Like it really won me over in a way I wasn't expecting it to. Because I was already expecting that going into this preview, that I was expecting it to be pretty good. But I didn't know how much I was going to like it. But I really liked my time with this game. Like, I thought it was really fun. Again, it was super creative. It visually looks fantastic on next-gen consoles. Again, it's not going to be, the definitive, Xbox experience that's going to show off everything that the new hardware can put together. But it is still a very impressive-looking game. And I think if you like 3D platformers, if you like the Mario games, if you like any 3D platforming with some puzzle elements and some combat, I think you're totally going to dig Psychonauts 2. And I cannot wait for the full game to come out on August 25th on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, Xbox Series S, and PC. Plus, it's on Game Pass. So like I said, if you've got Game Pass, just install it and try for it yourself. And I think you'll probably really dig this one. That's all for me on this episode of The Extra Mile. You can hit me up on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You also find the Pantsman himself on Twitter at Sean Capri. You also find Matt Sawinski, my PlayStation Drive co-host, over on Twitter at BurnoutBrider. So that's going to do it for this preview of Psychonauts 2. Again, huge thank you once again, of course, to Xbox Canada, as well as Double Fine for providing us this opportunity to check out this game early. And like I said, we will have a full review of the game as part of an Extra Mile episode after the game comes out. So you can look for that here on the YouTubes or as well on the Xbox Drive and PlayStation Drive feeds. I'm Ryan Turford. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Extra Mile, and we out.